So welcome everybody to the first session of our Code Clinic for Salesforce. We have two participants today that already submitted their request and registered for consultations. And this is, of course, being the first session, we're going to try and play with this format and try to figure out if timing is correct, what we can do to make sure that everybody gets the most out of these Code Clinic sessions. So first of all, again, welcome. Second of all, I hope that this will work as it is, and if not, of course, the future sessions we will work on making them more and more effective and efficient, and hopefully in the future we'll start to get some more Code Clinics going on as well, more than once a week. These sessions are being recorded, and that means that I will be posting these videos on the Code Clinic blog after each session with any kind of references that make sense to include from what we reviewed in the session. And with that in mind, of course, we want to make sure that we never share any information that is confidential to our companies and so on. So our first consultee is Arnold Brown. And actually, before we start with you, Arnold, I just wanted to thank also Luke Kushanik, who is also here tonight. Luke is also a Salesforce MVP and lives in the New York area. And so we've we've been working together in the community for many years now.
And I'm excited to join and try out this new format, new approach to sharing knowledge and learning and, well, of course, debugging code.
Yes, debugging code is fun. To those of you who may not be aware, Luke and I previously recorded a webinar series that is aimed at teaching administrators or novice developers Apex. And so if you ever want to find that series, there's about, I think, 13 or 14 sessions. They're all recorded and available on the New York City Developer User Group YouTube channel. So I can include a link to that in the blog post after this session. But that is also a great resource to kind of start from scratch and learn about Apex and just understand how Salesforce development works. Of course, there's many, many other resources, and Google is your friend. I'm not going to spend our time right now just going over all of them because there's a million. So with that, Arnold, welcome to our Code Clinic. You get the exciting opportunity to be our first ever consultee. So so let's just a couple of questions, maybe introduce you, Arnold. Can you share with us where you are based off?
Sure. I live and work in the Boston area.
Okay.
My 9 to 5 is as a Salesforce admin for a company called Bright Horizons Family Solutions. And in that role, I've been an administrator in my 5th year now.
Oh.
And have sort of been climbing up to being able to work in code a little bit. Got a couple of triggers in production, but what I submitted tonight is actually for a nonprofit org that I admin. I've been adminning that for 6 or 7 years. That's sort of how I got started in Salesforce, was by spinning up an org for a nonprofit. And I just have this one trigger that relies on a custom setting. We have the nonprofit starter pack. It's a nonprofit org. The group is called the Neuropsychoanalysis Foundation.
Okay.
And we use the nonprofit starter pack, and I've just got this test class that was passing okay when I implemented it, and now it's failing. And I didn't. It's not like I did the bonehead thing. I didn't create a new validation rule that broke it. It starts failing on too many SQL queries, something to do with the nonprofit starter pack, which is kind of a blind alley because the code is obscured. So, it's been failing, and it's it's been annoying me, and I can't really deploy anything until I get this thing figured out. So that's why I'm here.
That makes sense. So again, thank you for joining us. You're exactly the kind of people that I'm aiming with the Code Clinic, people who are or have been admins and are really trying to get more into development. And so they, you may have written some stuff and just want to make sure that your stuff works and it's written well. And to become a developer is a very fun path and challenging. And one of the biggest skills, I think, for any developer to learn is debugging, right? How do you find when your code doesn't do what it's supposed to? How do you figure out what is wrong? And I think based on what I've looked at your code, and Arnold also joined us kind of last minute. We had another consultee that had to cancel last night. So Arnold just joined, signed up last night, registered, and shared his code with me today. And I haven't had a lot of time to look at the code, but I did dig in a little bit. And so, we're probably going to do some discovery together, and hopefully we'll be able to find everything that's wrong with it. And then one more caveat before we actually jump in and start looking at this. The non-profit starter pack, is obviously offered by Salesforce, so we can expect code to be overall written well. But with that, I will put the caveat that I don't have a lot of experience with it. So we'll have to figure out what we see. And again, I'm fairly confident we'll be able to figure out what's going on. So with that, I'm going to open my, share my screen. And please tell me when you can see the developer console that I have open.
Looking good. Got it.
Okay. So I assume that everybody else can see it. I do have everybody else but Luke right now muted, Luke and Arnold. But if you have any questions, feel free to either use the chat button or you can kind of unmute yourself. I'm not blocking that right now, but just, be courteous and don't interrupt anyone who's already talking. Luke, you were going to say something?
I was just going to second the visual on the developer console.
Awesome. Okay. So with that, let's start to take a look and just describe what we're seeing in the developer console right now. So what Arnold contacted me and said that he needs help with is this test class, this set region field test class, which currently is failing. So whenever he tries to run a test, it fails with a message that says too many SQL queries. All right, so let's actually start by trying to run this test and see what happens.
Super. Yeah, there's two methods. There's a lead and a contact.
Right. So we can see here the contact region test method, and another one at the bottom is lead region test.
Right.
And we can see immediately.
Yeah. The lead one is not, strangely. Expand the test bit. Granularity.
Yep. So let's just take a look here, and when we expand this, of course, we can see that the set region field test, and it has two methods in it. The lead region test passed, but the contact region test did not. So now we want to figure out what happened. So if we double click this, we see a really beautiful error message that says NPSP, which is the non-profit starter pack, too many SQL queries, meaning something caused the NPSP to run too many SQLs, and we need to figure out what that is. So another thing that we can do at this point, we can go to our logs tab, and we can also see the debug log and see the details around what's happening here. And usually what I'll try to start with is where we actually have the error message. So if I just use the filter and write too many, and one thing to always keep in mind is that the filter is case sensitive. So if I had written too many without using a capital T, nothing is found. So that has been even too many with a capital M also wouldn't work. But here we can see that this message is being displayed. And once I identified this line, if I remove my filter, my cursor still remains on that line. So I can start working back from where this failure is happening.
That's very good.
So immediately, of course, we can see that NPSP is causing too many SQL queries, and above that, we can start seeing some of this limit usage information. And so limit usage information is extremely useful. Obviously, we can see here right before this error message, we can see already that it consumed 99 out of the 100 allowed SQL queries. And so we can assume that if any one more SQL query, more than one, two more SQL queries are attempted, it will then, of course, throw this error, right? So we can also see that it seems like there's another managed package that has a trigger that's running on this instance, on the contact. But this one is not consuming any SQL messages. And in our default namespace, which essentially means your trigger or your code that is executing as a result of this test, there's no queries at all. So obviously, it's clear that this limit is inside the nonprofit starter pack managed package. Now, with managed packages, you may or may not know that, with managed packages, you cannot see the code. You're not able to see what their Apex code does or what their Apex code looks like at all. So even debugging anything related to a managed package is, I wouldn't say impossible, but it's much more difficult.
Thoroughly frustrating, yes.
Yes, it can be extremely frustrating. But what we can do, couple of things. First of all, when we look at the debug code for managed packages, the one thing that we can see actually is the SQL queries. So as I scroll up here, I can see that there's a select statement here that is inside the managed package. So I can't see what happens or what it does with it, but I can see that this managed package retrieved one row. And that's pretty much, that select statement retrieved one row. And that's pretty much all I can see. There's one other thing that we can add to this view that makes our life a little bit easier. And if I click over these events, or really any one of these columns, and I click the down arrow, I can add a column called method. And this just allows me sometimes to see some important information about where is this code being executed. In a scenario where you have a trigger that's calling a helper class or something else, then you can see where your code is executing. Just give me 1 second, I apologize.
This is great, thank you very much.
Yep. So before I actually start to try and debug this, let's actually start to take a look at our code, okay? And let's try and see what you are doing here. So your test is essentially trying to create some contacts, right? You have a list of countries that you define here, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4 countries. And what you're doing afterward is you're iterating through those countries, and you're trying to create a new contact and insert it for each one of these countries. After that, you're creating an additional contact and inserting it. And then you're querying it and doing some assert. And then you're doing some other contacts, inserting and updating and updating. And essentially, it looks like you're just trying to check if your update trigger is working as expected.
Yep.
Okay. So the first thing that I can note, and I can see that right away as soon as I start looking at the code, is something that is considered a very big no-no in the Salesforce world, and that is this insert statement is inside a for loop.
Oh, that's dumb.
I wouldn't say dumb.
Well, but there's only three. But there's only 3 of them. I mean,
there's 4 contacts are being created. You're right. Yeah. It's not. I'm not saying this is the problem. My goal here is not just to, it's really to kind of just look and try and find, and also give you any kind of advice or any kind of comment on your code, so that we know that your future code is going to be better than your current code.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I should make a list. then insert the list outside.
Exactly. So that by itself doesn't explain still why this is happening, because as you mentioned, there's really only 4 contacts that are inserted as a result of this loop. Another thing that I can tell you is that while this for loop absolutely works, it's a little bit more complicated than you probably needed to. Oh, actually, I see why you did that. When you iterate, you can iterate. This is what we call a classic or traditional, rather, for loop, where you identify a counter, in this case, an integer called I. You instantiate it as 0. You increase it every time that the loop completes by 1, and you say continue running until I is smaller than the size of this list of countries. In other words, because I starts as 0 and a list is always 0 based, then you know that you'll create a contact for each one of those. But let's try and put a list of contacts. And I'll just follow your naming convention, CTCTS. And we'll say it's a new list of contacts. And instead of this insert CNew, now I can say CTCTS.add CNew. So in essence, all we're doing now is every time this loop goes through, we are just adding this contact to a list of contacts. And after the loop is completed, we want to try and insert our contacts.
Thank you.
So far looks great. Let's try and run this test again and see what happens. Oh, you know what? I forgot to click save. That would help. Okay, so now that it's saved, let me try and run this again. And interestingly enough, we now get a different error. And now we get an error saying assertion failed. And if I go to my test tab, and I see this one that failed, and I see that there's an assertion in line 28 that failed. So what is line 28? Line 28 is checking that the contact has been, the region has been updated to Chile, based on the country Chile to the region Latin America. And so actually, before we even continue, I'll just kind of go over and show everybody on the line what this is actually doing. So when we are inserting a contact, Arnold created a trigger. And this trigger works before insert and before update. And he uses a method that checks what we call recursive check. And recursive check allows us to check if a trigger is running more than one time in one execution context. And that means that sometimes a trigger or a workflow can cause a trigger to run more than one time on the record. So by implementing this check recursive class, static class, we're able to check, to set a variable to true when we run it. And then every time that that variable stays true through the entire execution context. So we can always go back and check, hey, did this trigger run already or not? And so what he's doing here in this trigger, he checks has this run before? And it would return true if it did not run before. And so now it checks if is it before trigger. In other words, it will not do anything if it's an after trigger. And then he's saying if this is an insert, then call this class and you apply this method to trigger.new. If it's not an insert, then if it's an update, then just do the same, but call a different method called update contact region. So this is for new contact, and this is for an update contact. And if we look at set region field, this is this class right here. And here's a new contact region method. And we can see that it accepts a list of contacts, which was passed from the trigger. We passed trigger.new, which is a list of contacts. We passed it into this class and into this method. And what Arnold is doing now, he's actually getting a map from a custom setting called region coding. And this custom setting has a list of countries and the name of region that these countries belong to. And then we iterate through each contact in this list that we got, and we say if the mailing country is not empty, meaning there isn't a country, then let's make it capital. You can see that it takes the mailing country and puts it to uppercase and assigns it to a string called cap country. And then he checks, does this map that we got from the custom setting contain this country? And if it does, it will assign the region that this country belongs to this region contact field on the contact. And if it can't find it in the map, if it does not contain this key, it goes into the else statement and it will assign no region found for this country. And pretty much the same thing happens for the update, but in this case, he also checks if the country has changed before he's trying to do anything with it. And so he compares the old contact list, the old trigger, the trigger.old, to the trigger.new. So with that, let's go back here and see what we think happened. So, we inserted this contact, and now we try to insert another contact where we set the mailing country to Chile, and we then insert it. After we insert, we query it back from the database, and you expect to see that the region contact is going to be Latin America. But for whatever reason, the region is not set to Latin America. So Arnold, right off the bat, I'm going to ask you, do you have a suspicion why this is?
Yeah, I think I commented out the check recursive run reset.
Perfect.
Because I was worried, because it was over querying. I was getting over query limit and just out of desperation commented that out.
Desperation causes a lot of fun stuff. But that is actually correct. And the way that I've found it when I looked at your code just before this session is I tried to set the debug statement inside this trigger. And I noticed, interestingly, that it wasn't showing in the debug log for running the test. And then I realized that we do the insert here, and that runs your class for the first time and sets the recursive flag. And so the next time that this trigger runs, it actually stops here in this if statement because that is false and it doesn't do it. So if we remove this check recursive, if we uncomment it rather, we set it back to true, and that essentially resets this flag and allows us to make sure that the trigger runs for this record. So yes, sorry. Yes, Arnold, you were going to say something?
I was going to say save it before you run it.
Yep, thank you. Now, before I even continue, what I want to do now is take this section of code that we know what it's supposed to do, and I want to comment everything after that. Let's try to work with a really limited scope of code and make it a little bit easier for us to find where the problem is. So all we're doing right now is we're inserting these 5 contacts, and then we're inserting another contact, and we're running some assertion on that contact. Make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let's try to run this test and see what happens. So interestingly enough, this test now passes. And you can see that contact region test passed. That means that the assertion is correct, and we did not exceed our governor limit at this point. Okay, but I did comment out a bunch of operations. What I want to do before we start to uncomment code, I want to look at this log for a quick second. And here's the one that succeeded. I'm going to open it.
I think you commented out the updates, right?
I commented out the updates, correct.
I'm also quite curious about how many SOQL queries were run after you bulkified the insert from the for loop.
Right.
That is exactly what I was just about to look at. So what we can do is we can go towards the end of this log and again try to find that limit usage. And we can see that in the NPSP package, we just ran 2 SOQL queries.
Yeah, that's a better number.
Yeah, it's much better than 99, right?
Yeah.
But we're getting close to as much as I had time to prepare in advance. But I also know what will happen soon. So let's uncomment this and just let's take the next test that you're trying to do. I'm still keeping this thing commented. We just have one more contact you're going to test now. And so we're setting check recursive to true again because we want your trigger to run on our next operation. And you're now actually taking this contact that we already inserted, you're changing the mailing country, and you're calling an update statement, right? And then you're querying it back from the database into a new contact, and you expect the region based on the country United States to show North America. Looks good to me. Let's see what happens when we run this test. So it succeeded again, which is great. And I want to look at this number of SOQL queries again, because
Did it all the way succeed, or did it just succeed at running?
it succeeded. The test succeeded. Otherwise, we would see this error, some kind of error message here, right? So if I look at the test, we can see that it was successful.
Damn.
But it's only successful. It's not your entire test right now, because I still have some of your code commented.
Right.
We can see now that your SOQL queries is still. Let's do this number of SOQL queries. I want to see what this looks like. So we can see that throughout this entire thing, I don't really see anything with more than 2. But here we do see some stuff. So let's see what this is all about. So it is actually consuming already 66 queries. And this is something that's sometimes a little bit funky, and I don't actually know why it is. Luke, if you know, or Chris, if you know, one of my colleagues, Chris Cavallari, who's also a very experienced developer, also joined us. So hi, Chris, I didn't introduce you. But if you have anything to add, please feel free to interrupt. Luke or Chris, do you know why we would see in any NPSP here that with 66, and the next time we see that it is 2?
I don't. And one comment is he's grabbing that setting every time in the trigger. You could cache that setting and not be querying that setting object as well.
This here, right?
Yeah.
Right, and this is actually not a query, right? Custom setting doesn't consider a SOQL query.
Right.
And I was thinking that the reason we're seeing so many of the limit usage reports, do they? If I understand them correctly, each time we're seeing it, it's after one section of a transaction. So if we insert a contact, there's going to be a before insert block, and it's going to give us the limit usage output for that. Then if there's happens to be an update that happens to that record, there's going to be a limit usage for the before and after update. So each of those is segmented, and then those just continue to roll up until you get to the very end of all the transactions or all of the operations within this one transaction.
Yeah, and this is why it's weird to me. So I agree. I mean, it essentially continues rolling up and adding. But what is confusing to me is that I see this number of SOQL queries 66, wherever it was, sorry.
Now we've also got quite a few. We've also got quite a few separate transactions here. Each insert, each update on its own is a distinct transaction that's occurring. So, the first insert is not has its own limits. Then the second one, the update, is going to have its own limits because they're independent transactions.
So they will show their own count of transactions, but then they actually still all the transactions still roll up to one execution context.
I don't think we're looking at. I think we could actually have multiple, like those 66 that we see could actually be 66, then another 66, bringing us to 133, and then 199. But because each happens within its own transaction, none of them actually tip over the limit. But we're really seeing the whole run of the test, which has all of those inserts and updates. Sometimes within a test, if you can identify where a test start and stop can be placed around the code, to at least segment your actual test from like the test setup. You can somewhat further mitigate any hazards against limits just in the test space itself.
So, okay, so let's continue and try to uncomment some more code and see what happens. The one thing that I will say, Arnold, even the approach you're doing here, it's not necessarily wrong, but what you're doing here is you're doing this. You're inserting 5 contacts, or 4 contacts rather, then you're inserting another one, and then you're doing a bunch of separate update statements to check that it works. Another thing you can do, instead of doing all these different updates, is work with that list of contacts that we created and update them. And so then what you can do is you can have one single insert transaction and one single update transaction, and then iterate through the records to see if, a search for each one of those contacts, both on the insert side and on the update side. So instead of having to do, all of this stuff, you can essentially have 2 loops. One does the insert, and then another loop that queries them again and iterates through each one to see that the region is not null, and then go through
update the list instead of
exactly
outside of the loop.
Exactly. So then doing iterating through that list again, updating all of them, and then calling the update statement on the list. Because what's happening here is that even if it's inside the NPSP, all of these update statements, as Luke mentioned, they're all happening. They're independent statements, and each one of these update statements is going to cause NPSP to run. And it's enough that NPSP, for whatever reason, whether it's incorrect bad coding or whether it's really valid, something that they just need to do a bunch of SQL queries, it may be consuming a lot of your governor limits for each one of these update statements. And so for that reason, it might be much more beneficial to just do one update statement on all of them rather than to do update one by one, call this update statement so many times.
Well, I mean, as I look at it now, and I can see the code coverage on the trigger is okay, but if the code coverage is okay on the class and method, then as I look back at this a while ago, I wonder, can I just delete all that? If the coverage is done, then it might just be done.
Well, keep in mind that the purpose of test classes, test classes serve several purposes, right? If you read the documentation, it's very clear that the purpose of test class is not to provide code coverage. And that is something that I always, when I teach new developers, is one of the first points that I make, right? The purpose of a test class is not to provide test coverage. Salesforce checks that you have code coverage, because that's really the only way for them to know that you've done some kind of testing. But they can't really know if you've tested every use case that you think your code should be able to handle. The real purpose of test class is to make sure that your code behaves as you expect.
Assertions.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly, assertions. But not just to use an assertion and say, yes, I got the assertion, but also think about what we call positive tests and negative tests. Make sure that when I provided a bad value, my class can handle it without throwing an exception. So you can create a bad value and get the assertion that says, hey, this was wrong. But really, again, if you just think about the true purpose of test classes, it's a programmatic way to make sure that your code does what it is supposed to do. And how do you do this? You throw things at your code, right? You throw data at your code. You say to the code, hey, process this piece of data that I just created, and I expect after you process it to see these results. And that's what we do with assertions.
So feed it the same kind of junk that my 9-to-5 job gets in the ETL from the back office system.
I'm sorry, can you repeat what you just said?
Feed it the same kind of junk data that it gets from an ETL from a bad back office system.
Yeah, exactly. So you need to make sure that your code can handle whatever you throw into it, right? And one of the things that not many people realize, but Salesforce will actually execute your tests in your environment to make sure that new releases of Salesforce don't break your code.
The hammer.
Yeah, what they call exactly the execution hammer. But another thing to realize is that sometimes you you probably know that already, but sometimes an admin may break your code by putting a workflow or a process builder that changes the value that you set to something else. In fact, I had a developer that asked me, they had a trigger that was checking, I can't remember the exact detail, but they had a trigger. The trigger was checking if this condition is true, set, let's say, the country to whatever, right, or the region to whatever, just like you're doing. And then an admin created a process builder that changed it to something else.
Nice.
And then the assertion was looking for the value that he expected. But, of course, the value wasn't the same because the process builder runs in the order of execution. The process builder runs after the before trigger. So his before trigger was setting the value correctly. And then throughout the whole order of execution of that insert, the process builder was changing it. And by the time it got to the assertion failed. So by putting these assertions, you not only provide code coverage, you not only make sure that your code actually does what it needs to do, you're also able to identify and catch these kind of things that admins shouldn't do that break your code.
Right. I have there's a package by the guy who wrote the Advanced Apex Guide. Has this package that runs all your tests at midnight and sends you an email if any of them break. And so
okay.
I've been getting that email every single day. So I'm really happy to see this moving forward.
Okay, that's great.
Is
so
it covering the set region class at this point?
I expect it would, because essentially all of your update statements, you're testing different regions.
One, right? Theoretically, I should only need one update statement.
One update should cover it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because you're testing different countries, but all of them are causing the same code to execute. So if we look here, you have 81% coverage.
Okay.
And the reason you have 81% is that this part of the code is not being executed.
Right. I need to put in something that would break it, and then I get up to 100.
Yeah, you just need to put a country that isn't in your custom settings.
Right.
And here you can also check if mailing country is empty. It's not empty. What is that?
Not is not.
Yeah. Not is not. So if it is empty.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. So when you talk about providing good code coverage, there's really zero reason for you not to cover this use case, right? You can get to 100% coverage on this.
Just add something to the list that would be the list at the top of countries. You could add in something that was the
yeah, we can add here CodeClinic.
Country of confusion, right?
But now we need to make sure, instead of Europe, we need to make sure that it gets this no region for this country, right?
Yeah, and I have an exception report that fires so that if any contacts have that setting, I get a report, and then I add the country to the custom list, so it sort of pings me if there's something missing.
Good.
Yeah, it's admin trick, right?
So now that it's passed, we see we have a little bit more code coverage, because now somewhere it should have, in the update statement, it did get here. So you want to try to insert one that has an invalid country as well, right? And then just want to handle all of these scenarios. So
add an invalid country to your list at the top.
Yeah, to the lead also add an invalid country and add one with no country.
Yeah.
So I think that you have enough information to kind of take this and go forward with this. There's one more piece of information that I would like to impart on you before we move on, and that is this see all data true. It's very tempting to use see all data true because it saves us the pain of having to set all of our test data.
Well, it's the custom setting. In this instance, it's the custom setting that I want the test to be able to do. So.
Exactly. And in this case, I was just about to say, in this case, I know that it's just for the custom settings. But don't be tempted to do this, because what can happen is if your custom settings changes at some point, let's say that you remove a country for whatever reason, or you change the region of one of the countries in your production custom settings that you use in your test. Your test is still expecting it to be in the old region, and for that reason, your test will break, right? So then you'll have to go and modify your test to the new region. Instead, you should set up your custom settings data here. So you can, you can just like you do with this loop of inserting contacts, you can also insert the custom settings with the region values for them, and then just test the ones. And then you can also test the scenario where, where it's not there,
right?
Where you know which value is never going to be in the custom settings.
Right.
Right. So in general, I always urge any developer, do whatever you can to avoid using see all data. It's a shortcut. It makes writing the test class easier, but it comes with a lot of risk in terms of, long-term testing reliability, call it, right? And there's definitely use cases that see all data is almost the only way you can actually do what you need to do, especially when you interact with managed packages that may not allow you to do some things and create some records. But in this scenario, I don't think this is one of them, and I would urge you to remove that and create your own custom setting data in the test class.
Thank you very, very much. And that was
one
45 minutes. That was like perfect. Wow.
And actually, I will say one more thing. Are you familiar with test.startTest and test.endTest?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know what the purpose of those are?
It sort of puts a container around the execution context, so that your limits are calculated within the test, and it sort of resets your limits. So
that's exactly right. Yeah. So in other words, you're able to separate the limits or reset your limits after you set your data up. And that's really the idea, right? You use a lot of times just to create the data you need for test, you may already consume 20, 30 SOQL or DMLs or whatever it is. And by that, by the time you start to actually test with the data you just created, you don't have enough governor limits to be able to complete a test that in production would otherwise work.
So in this class, would I put test.startTest right above, between lines 17 and 18 before I insert them? Is that where it would go?
That definitely can be a good place to do that. I would also do that after you insert the custom setting data. Chris, you were going to say something?
I was going to say you can also do a test setup method.
Yep.
A test setup method is a great place to set up all your data, and that way you can it does it in a separate transaction, so you can check and the transactions have already occurred, and B, it is available to all classes throughout your test. So if you wanted to set up another test method within this class, that data that you did in your setup would still be available there as well, and it would be independent. It would be reset. So you don't, if you have things that are like you don't want overlapping or you don't want duplicates, test setup is a great way to handle all of that.
Yep. Perfect. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing for test setup methods is the fact that if you have multiple test methods in your test class and they all need pretty much the same base data, then instead of setting the data every time, your test method data, whatever is set up, will be available to all of your methods, as Chris said. And you can always, for every test method that runs, it will be the pure test data that you inserted and not the modified. So in other words, if you created the data and then in your first test method you changed it, and then you expect your second test method to see the data as well, it will again be the data that you inserted, not anything that was changed in the first test method. So it becomes very reliable way to set up data that you need to test in multiple test methods.
One more comment, Ohad, is it would allow him to break this test into 3 or 4 different tests very easily and get around his limits issue, because he would be doing 1 transaction per test. So he could do his insert transaction and then do all of his different update tests as separate tests.
That's a good point, right? Arnold, you could break your test methods, and instead of contact region test, you can do new contact region test and update contact region test to test those things separately. Again, for this specific use case, it might feel a little bit like an overkill, but at the same time, it's really great to start using these concepts as early as possible and on simple classes, because it's really easy to implement them here. And as your code gets more and more complex, you already understand, or at least to somewhat understand, how these things are used and how they work.
And this is Luke. I do want to offer a correction and an apology. I think I gave some misinformation earlier about when we were looking at all those SOQL queries. And I thought, well, there's a different transaction. We have that insert on line 25, and then we update it. And I said, oh, but those are separate transactions. They each have their own limit. And that I was thinking that's how it should be in a unit test, but that's not how it is. They do accumulate. And as we were just talking about with start and stop tests, they give you a chance to sort of break out of that once and say, here's the test. This should have its own set of limits aside from the test data setup. But I just wanted to clear that up in case anyone was paying attention to what I said earlier. I don't want them to go off into the world with that misinformation in their heads.
So I misunderstood you, actually, because I thought you meant that what we're seeing in the count is just the count of that transaction, and then it accumulates underneath it. So even though you gave a partially wrong answer, I misunderstood it as a correct answer. Okay. And Arnold, any questions before we cut off?
No, I'm grateful. I'm thinking, is there someone else queued up for the next consultation? I don't want to take time away from them.
Hima, are you here?
I'll see you guys on Untapped.
Yeah. I just wanted a couple other quick comments here. You actually can see the code for the Nonprofit Starter Pack. It's available on GitHub. They have the repos out there for Salesforce Foundation. Now, just because you can see it doesn't mean you can necessarily read it quickly. I was taking a look at it earlier on, and it's some pretty dense and advanced code.
I'll bet it's deep. Yeah.
But it is publicly available. And then the other comment I wanted to say is just give a compliment to Arnold. I like how your trigger was set up, hands off everything to the classes right away. That's a very efficient, practical way to do it. And, and just all of the other formatting looks really good.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you very much. I guess there is one other thing, which is just, it's probably out of scope, but in the interface for NPSP, there's an NPSP Settings, and there's a place where you can look at the trigger handler and add things to it. And it's very limiting. The NPSP thing is, I'm finding it really hard to add, because then you have to stitch things into their trigger handler, and it's really a hell of a system.
So before we get into this, and let's see what's happening, because we do have a second person, but I don't know if she's here. Hima, are you online? Hima? I'm not sure if she's here. So
we have a viewer 8.
Yeah, there's a viewer 8 and viewer 3, but I'm not hearing anything. So,
okay.
Now, who is viewer 3, by the way? Viewer 3 wrote us a pro tip that I'd like to address.
Yours truly.
Who is this?
Elad.
Oh, hi, Elad. That's my brother. So he says from the NPSP settings.
Myself. So just
okay. So since Hima is not here, Arnold, we can continue to look at your other question.
Great.
So guide me. What do you want to look at?
You want to go back to Salesforce and minimize the developer console, please. And instead of sales, change your application to NPSP. And you'll have, and it's similar to the pro tip that he was directing you to. There's a settings tab, NPSP settings. System tools, yep. And then, so the pro tip was about the error log and my sort of, and so that's handy to know. Didn't know that.
Yeah, what's interesting is I'm curious if they log errors when you run it from a test, because I don't see here anything.
Right. And then,
yeah.
And then the trigger configuration area was sort of the deep dark. The minute you put in, it's and so for me, as a novice developer, sort of like, okay, I want to add a trigger to contact, and honestly, I'm not sure if I even put it in here or if I should put it in here.
Wow, that is some pretty cool stuff. I hadn't seen that before, and I can grasp its purpose. And forget about grasping like how I would write something like that. But yeah, that's pretty cool. That's how they do it.
Right. So knowing that this existed, when I got too many SOQL queries, that was when I tapped out. But seeing that having 3 inserts in a loop, it blows my mind that's sort of the test class failing because there were 3 inserts inside a loop, and then the fact that it got multiplied by this it's just sort of amazing to me that's the root cause, and it's also embarrassing because it's Dev 101, don't insert in a loop, but if it's only 3 of them, you think you can get away with it, and then now here I am.
That's okay. We're learning together. Let me ask you this: what are these classes on Contact? Do you know?
I saw a lot of those in the GitHub repo when I was browsing it earlier, and Those look like those are all part of the package.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks like they have a lot of logic when you create a contact to create affiliations, create accounts, different kind of accounts that it needs to validate. So it's probably related to all of those contact insertion and updates activities as relates to affiliations, relationships, and accounts.
Okay. It is a hell of a package, the NPSP. I mean, on the one hand, they do a lot for you, but on the other hand, they do a lot to you.
By the way, your microphone is not so good, very muffled. But so again, I don't know that NPSP so well, and I would absolutely look at the documentation. But I suspect I know what it is. You probably implement an interface that they created, and then you don't actually write a trigger. You just write a class that that their trigger can call. So when you add that here, the trigger would say, oh, after I do the zeros and the ones and the twos, I'm going to call the 3, which is one that you've added, which is a class that implements an interface that I assume that they have, which means that it can handle things like the before, insert, before, update, after, and so on.
Well, that's why
I mean, hell, we're in a sandbox. Hit the new button, Ohad. Give it a go. See what it looks like.
I'm guessing it will ask us to select a real.
Well, it's also why the way you wrote your trigger is so good, because it'll make it very easy to plug in your classes into this interface.
The problem is you would have to make some changes in your class. Because right now, from your trigger, you're calling your method, your specific method.
Right.
So your methods will have to be renamed, and it will have to implement an interface so that the NPSP trigger knows exactly which method to call for the before and after and what to pass it. Right? Because right now, if we just add that here, you can put the class. So we can, let's try. I promise you it will fail, but it will not let you. But let's try. Let's see what happens. And say
but then
before.
you'd have to put the method in, right? It won't take the whole class.
How could you call a class? How could you call a class without calling a method?
Well, maybe it wants class.method.
No. So that's what when we say interface, right? I'm not going to get into interface because that's relatively advanced and out of scope for today's session for sure. But what interfaces allow a programmer to do is to define methods, right? So they can define a method on their interface that says run before update, and another method called run after update, and another method called run before insert, and another one called run after insert. When you implement the interface, now you have the ability to write the code for those methods. So they provide to you the name of the methods and their constructs. In other words, what you will get, what variables you're getting when they call that method. And then it's up to you to write the code of how it is handled. So in other words, you don't actually you don't tell them what methods to call. They tell you what a method is called based on what their interface has. So, there's probably an NPSP developer document somewhere that tells you how to implement this.
Yeah. Okay. Super.
So
thank you.
I would say that the trigger you created is a prime candidate for you to try and play with this, because again, you have all of your stuff is already in a helper class. So all you have to learn to do that is, how do interfaces work? How do you implement them? And then you'll have to make some, rename those methods, maybe rename some of the variables. But, the code itself, the logic itself would stay pretty much the same.
Okay. Super.
Okay. I bet that if I try to insert this, I hope that if I try to insert it, they will.
Right. You hope
it breaks. Yeah, they don't. Here it is. But let's see what happens now when you try to run a contact, to create a contact.
So you have
We
to
did this
deactivate
before.
the trigger first.
Don't forget to deactivate. Yeah, you got it. Deactivate the trigger.
Which trigger?
My trigger.
Oh,
From the,
fine.
You were going for the false positive, weren't you? I can do it from here.
There you go.
Does anybody know why sometimes in the developer console there's a little active checkbox here and why sometimes there isn't? I guess the answer is no.
It's a great question. Well, I'll bet you, maybe it's different in a dev org from a sandbox.
I have no clue.
That's my guess. It's a bad
Okay,
guess.
so it's disabled now, and we're going to insert a contact. I promise you it won't do what it's supposed to do. Because their trigger doesn't know how to call your method.
Mm-hmm. So all you need is last name and a country.
A brief their table trigger management there basically just runs a single trigger for all classes. So you actually don't write another trigger. You write a class. And
that's what I said. You write a class that implements their interface.
Implements their trigger handler. Exactly right. And then their trigger handler executes your code within their single trigger.
You actually want mailing country on the right, not other country.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Well, it doesn't matter. Again, it won't do anything because we didn't implement their interface. And so for that reason.
Oh, okay. Well, I was hoping to see the red trigger fail error.
It won't fail. It just, they will try to call your class, and your class doesn't have that method.
Uh-huh.
We just won't do anything. Mailing country, where is that?
You have to edit it to get access to the mailing country field, which should be on the right.
There we go. No region.
Bingo.
Yeah, but I don't know if that is a trigger handler. Here we go. Table-driven trigger management. This is pretty awesome, honestly. So here's all the information you need to know. Disable, create your own custom code. Here we go.
Wow.
So here's your class instance. So this is a great blog.
Snowed in Boston.
So yeah, this is a great blog to read on how to implement the TDTM.
Thank you.
Oh, and is that the link that you shared, Chris? The same one?
Yeah,
it looks like it.
I shared the link. Yeah.
Yep. Awesome. Yep. I will add that to the blog post as well. Okay. So Hima I don't think she's here. And so that means that we can either be finished early or we can open the stage to any other questions that anybody on the line may have, or Arnold, if you have any other ones.
No, I feel like I've taken enough airtime if anyone else has questions or comments. Okay,
so the stage is open. We have Clement Chan. Nicholas doesn't have any questions because he has a direct line to my ear. So I think, Arnold, you have the opportunity, since nobody else seems to want to talk, you have the opportunity to ask other questions if you have. You have another 20 minutes of my time, of our time.
I think I'm going to give you back your 20 minutes, brother.
Sounds good.
I need to work on it. I need to upload a change set to production right away.
Sounds good.
Did we talk about the other alternative of using @test setup as another way to avoid the governor limits in unit tests?
Yeah, that's what Chris was talking about, creating a test setup method. Yep. Okay, so great. So this was our first Code Clinic session. I think this was successful because we did solve a problem. So kudos to you guys. Thanks, Liz, Luke and Chris for joining. Arnold, thank you for joining as well. I will probably post this back to the Code Clinic, the recording, and any link that is relevant sometime tomorrow. So with that, Luke, any parting words?
This was excellent. I look forward to joining for more, and I'll be hunting through my code to see. All right, what can OHOD help me improve?
Oh no. Okay. So see you guys all next Thursday. Have a great one.
Thank you, gentlemen. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.